All right. Well, here we go. We're going to just go with when he's done in this first section, then we'll take a break, go have lunch, and then come back for the rest of the day. That make sense?
Yeah.
Well, good. You can pray for yourself. When I pray, it's just like revival breaks out.
You want to give me a chance?
People start dancing and everything. I
want to see that.
All right. Good morning.
do. Good morning.
Have a seat there, Carl, if you can.
If you can.
Oh, you made it. Good. Okay. Good job.
I told them that you were very nice to me.
I am nice to you. You just have history.
Well,
Oh, there we go.
there we go.
So the way that Carl explained this day to me is that we're going to talk about some things that you're going to have already some familiarity with, which is really a blessing for me, because quite honestly, when it comes to the topics of kind of learning to listen and respond and kind of securing a foundation for intimacy, I'm usually talking to people that have never thought about these things. So I'm going to make some assumptions based on the fact that you have experience, you have interest, you have history, and hope that what I can contribute will be helpful to that. And we'll end, particularly this morning and this afternoon, we'll end with a Q&A where we can, hopefully talk about more specific things that you're interested in or concerned about or want maybe some feedback from. I want to put the in everything that I say, both this morning and this afternoon, under the context of God's desire to have a loving, trust-filled relationship with us. That is the center. That's the goal. When Jesus is asked what's the greatest commandment, I think that sometimes we don't fully comprehend what that question was in the first century. That we imagine that the greatest commandment, like what's the most important one of all the hundreds of commandments there are, what's what's number one, that kind of thing, and that's fair. That's a fair evaluation that's being asked. Like what's most important to get right of all the commandments, and Jesus answered love. Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. But that question about greatest really has to do with what's the command that rules all the other commands. See, that's the thing.
Yeah.
It's not what's the most important command. It's what's the command that rules all the other commands. That would have been the interest of a first century scholar or Pharisee or someone who, because within the ancient world, this gets interesting, and I'm not going to stay here very long, but within the ancient world, in terms of both the philosophical schools and religious systems, this idea of the first principle,
Yes.
what's the principle that's above all other principles? What overrides and rules over all the other principles? When we think about just our world in terms of forces, the different forces that are, to bear in the universe, gravity and, these different things. It's kind of like, what's the force that rules all the forces? Mm-hmm. And within Greek thought, the word logos is central to this, first principle. So when John says that Jesus is the logos, he's the word, that doesn't simply mean he's the communication of God.
Right.
He's the first principle. He's the word that rules over all the other words.
So good.
Okay? So when Jesus answers that great commandment question and says it's about love,
Right.
that means that command to love God and to love others, to love one another, to love our enemies, that central first principle rules all the others.
Wow.
And so when we come to talk about things like listening to God, hearing from God, that we're understanding that in this context of love. So that's why Paul will say in 1 Corinthians 14, follow the way of love and eagerly desire spiritual gifts, especially the gift of prophecy, that love rules over those things. So without that understanding, then I think we just get way off base. If we think that hearing from God is about conquest or kind of, is about being right, or we will find ourselves kind of, even if we're a few degrees off down the road, being very far off from the target, which is love. My experience of learning to listen, we'll get into the notes, but my experience of learning to listen really began at my conversion. I wasn't raised in religion. I didn't go to church, but a handful of funny times as a child. I was part of what was happening in the Jesus movement and friends becoming Christians, and that kind of provoked me to want to read the Bible so I could defend myself against their obnoxiousness. And it was in the course of reading the Bible, in particular, kind of backtracking from the Gospels and reading in the prophet Isaiah, and where it says he was despised and forsaken of men. I had not put together that passage in Isaiah 53 is talking about Jesus, who I was just getting a little familiar with by reading the Gospels, but that phrase, whoever that was kind of offered up for my benefit, that person was despised and forsaken. When I read that passage, it is though an arrow shot out of the page and went through my heart and said, "You're guilty of that."
Wow.
So that precipitated my very first ever prayer, which was, "God, if you're up there, I'd really like to know, and if it has something to do with this Jesus, help me figure that out." That was all precipitated by an encounter with His Word, right? Not just reading and reflecting and thinking on it, but I had an encounter with His Word being living and active and sharper than any two-edged sword that kind of drilled me in the center of my life. So that was kind of the starting line for my faith. And I was encouraged and nurtured in a evangelical Presbyterian church, God's frozen people. So proud to be among them. That was my, that was the setting in which I kind of grew up as a young Christian. I was actually in university when all this happened, and I dropped my major, which was economics, and I thought I just want to know the Bible better. I actually wanted to drop out of college altogether. My mother, God rest her soul, she begged me not to do it. Like,
cool.
Don't throw, they wanted to have me deprogrammed, because nobody was, they really did. Like, they thought, why, he's just gone out of his mind. But my mother, God bless her, she begged me to not drop out of university. So I thought, well, how can I make this about what I'm interested in? And so I studied ancient history.
So good.
I studied Greek, Roman, and Egyptian history. That was my major in university. I just wanted to know the Bible better. Mm-hmm. And then I went off and studied theology in an academic way because I wanted to know the Bible better. And in the context of that, I never lost that sense of engagement, like something more than the text, something more than just, learning about background and learning the languages and all of that kind of thing. There was always in my heart and mind and goal this encounter with truth, that's what I was after. But something that was apart from God's Word, that kind of came into my life in an unexpected way. That I had a core group of friends. I lived in Vancouver. Nancy and I are family. We were all involved with churches there. Most of us were Americans living in Canada. We'd all gone to Regent College, this graduate school I'm talking about, and one of our number, Ken Blue, had come to California and to Fuller to do his doctor, whatever it was, the D-Min, and encountered John in a course at Fuller Seminary. He comes back, tells all his friends, like, I had this course, and it wasn't like any other course, and Ken had terrible back problems. He came back healed, and
Come on.
and he said, they're going to do a conference of this course, why don't we go down there? So that was 1983 or whatever it was, 1, 3, 4, whatever it was.
Wow.
We all went down to the conference. In this circle of friends, some of them were Pentecostal. I was thoroughly evangelical. The main difference between Pentecostals and evangelicals is evangelicals read books, Pentecostals listen to tapes or CDs, podcasts.
Oh, help us, Lord.
But my more Pentecostal friends were always concerned. They wanted me to, they weren't sure I had the Holy Spirit.
Yes, I'm Pentecostal.
And I knew that they weren't sure that I had, so it was all fine, but we go down to this, this Vineyard conference where, the Holy Spirit is kind of, front and center, and now they're all looking at me, like, how's David going to respond, and so how I responded initially was I thought, wow, this is kind of the first credible way of doing some of these things that I've ever seen, that I thought didn't, wasn't just about show or, manipulation or something. I was really touched. It wasn't I had a theological conviction against anything, that had to do with God actively being involved in our lives, but I just hadn't seen credible kind of witnesses of some things like healing or, having special information, prophecy, So okay, it's a long story. I got to cut it short. But so these friends, George and Bonnie Malone, they were lovely people, and they were part of this group. And one night after one of these, evenings, they said, "Can we pray for you?" I knew. I thought, they want me to speak in tongues, they want to, and sure enough, they started praying for me, blah, 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 kind of repeat after me, I just loved them. They were sweet people, and I was glad that they would pray for me. And then Bonnie says, as they're praying for me, and I'm not obviously giving them back what they want, but she says, I see a picture of you, and I don't know what it means, but I see a picture of you and you have a large parrot on your shoulder. I thought, I've always wanted to be a pirate, so like I'm a pirate for Jesus. I thought, I love this picture. I have a parrot on my shoulder. She said, but you're trying to get this parrot off. I thought, I don't know what that means. The backstory is, and this is so important about prophecy, is that the most powerful kind of prophetic ministry that happens from one person to another is when God allows you to contribute to a conversation He's already having with that person.
That's good.
Right? He's already having a conversation with them. You just get to kind of contribute to that conversation. That's the most powerful. So what that conversation was, that just months before, I was accepted in Cambridge in England to do my PhD in New Testament, and that was the road I was going to pursue. I was going to do the scholarly thing. I was going to teach, do that. And I was walking and praying one night in our neighborhood, and I felt God interrupt my life and say, do you want to be a disciple?
Wow.
And I thought, wow, it hurt my feelings. Because, I was like a Ronald Sider, like God. Some of you know what that is. Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger. I was like that kind of disciple. I thought, wow, I'm not a disciple? And I felt the Lord say to me, He said, you think being a good disciple is being a good student. And you're a good student. But being a disciple is being an apprentice of the family business.
So good.
And I want you to be an apprentice of the family business. And I knew that had to do with the salvation of people.
Wow.
And I thought, because obviously I was saved from being without God and without hope in the world. And so that was very tender to me. But I thought, yeah, I'm for that. I'll do that. But the Lord said, and I want to do that through my church. And I thought, oh. Because I honestly didn't like the church very much. I just thought church was silly and somewhat foolish. And now I feel like God's saying I'm supposed to work in the church and give up this other road. And there's the kick line was, I said to the Lord, I said, I don't think I can do that. Like all I knew about the way that churches were led is, and I'd been, and as a Christian, I went every Sunday. That's what Christians do. And because I read a lot and knew some, that most of the people that I saw speak, I heard books that they had read. Like,
Wow.
they were just the messages out of books they'd read. And which isn't a bad thing. I'm not at all like judging that. I just said to the Lord, I can't do that. I can't, kind of repeat someone else's understanding or whatever. That was my struggle. I thought the only model I've ever seen about being a pastor or a preacher was doing it that way, and I can't do it that way. And that kind of left the conversation there. So back to this image of the parent. So a few hours later, after they prayed for me after that session, a childhood friend of mine named Mike Bickle had come out to that conference because we were there. We grew up together, little boys in the same neighborhood. Mike has always been a Pied Piper. He's always had a whole collection of people following him since he was 5 years old. And we were friends and had become Christians around the same time in Kansas City in the Jesus movement, and went to the same high school and kept in touch. And when he found out that myself and another of our friends from Kansas City were going to this thing in California, he said, I'm coming and I'm bringing some guys with me who I have some prophets. I said, really? You have some prophets? Mike always had something. It's like, you have some prophets. Okay. So sure enough, he comes out there and he's got a couple of very strange guys, and he says, this night after this session where I got the parrot on my shoulder, he has a friend, wouldn't be known to any of you. He's not one of the Kansas City prophets, at least that most people would know about. Little tiny Hispanic guy, Pentecostal, really odd. He says, I want him to pray. So we had a bunch of these Vancouver people, and I want him to pray. And he would just got to go one from another. And I knew these people really well. And he was praying for them. And it was really accurate. I thought, well, that's interesting. And then it was my turn. And I just thought, take your best shot. Right? Take your very best shot.
That's good.
And he starts off, he's very Pentecostal. And thus saith the Lord. The Lord says to you, you're not a parrot. You're a voice and not an echo.
Wow.
It changed my life.
Come on.
Because it entered in the conversation. Oh, here's the other part. You're a voice and not an echo. Do it your way.
Good.
Wow.
That's why I'm here today.
Praise God.
It was entering in. So at that, just to finish this off a little bit, at that same conference, right, it's obvious that people were tapping into the Lord leading them in their interactions, ministry interactions with other people. And I thought, I want that. I didn't see that was like a special class of people got to do that. It was just really clear to me, from what the scripture said, that this is God's expectation for us as his people, that we be led. I love John 10, my sheep will follow me because they hear my voice, right? And that's not just, we get the download. It's that we recognize his voice. We recognize the character and the tone and the tenor of Jesus leading us, and that we follow that. I've led for 25 years a really big church and not a really big community. So everywhere I go, I run into one of three types of people who go to my church, people who used to go to my church, or people who will go to my church. So and I'll be in the grocery store and I'll be asking where's the flower aisle, and someone will say, turn and look at me. They've never probably met me, but they recognize my Pastor David, they said, they recognized my voice from saying, where's the flower eye? Right?
Tricky.
And it's that, I know that voice. I know, that so it's that recognition factor of, I thought, that's for us, right? That's why, Moses in Numbers 12 and the big blow up with Aaron and Miriam and they're all hurt because this thing has happened where God has told him to call the elders together and he's going to put the spirit that's on him on them, and they start prophesying and the people don't want anybody else prophesying but Moses, and Aaron and Miriam are thinking all along, well, we've been in this from the beginning. We've been prophesying. What's this all about? Moses. God then has to discipline Aaron and Miriam, but Moses says, are you when they say shut it down, stop all these people from prophesying? He says, are you jealous for my sake?
That's right.
Are you thinking, I want this job solely? He said, I wish that all of God's people were prophets. Now that's either a frustrated, burned out leader, which is possible in Moses' case, or he's speaking the truth. He knew what God wanted.
Yes, come on.
And that's what Joel says. God's going to pour out His Spirit on all flesh, and His sons and daughters are going to prophesy. This thing about hearing and responding, hearing from God and speaking or acting on His behalf or praying, at His request, that is meant for everybody.
So good.
And so I thought, well, that's me. I'm everybody. And I really resented hearing some of John's stories back in those days. The one I resent most of all was that story he had told about being on a plane or something. He read adultery on the guy's chest or his head or whatever. And I thought, I can read. God, just write on people. I'll read it, I promise. Write on them, I'll read it. Never, I kept looking for it in those days. So, writing to show up. It never showed up, I thought, I'm going to be terrible at this. Then I had this gal in our church, and she was in a home group with us, and she asked if she could meet with me, and it sounded pretty serious. She was in her late 30s and single, and she was hurting, and so we met at the church offices, and she tells me about this affair that she's having with a married man, and how she's desperate to be married and have a child, and she's fallen in love with this guy, and she knows it's wrong, and she's now under conviction. No one, just kind of in her heart that she has to break this off, and how can she do it? She loves this guy. Maybe this is her last chance at the things that she wants most. And so she's pouring out her, God bless her, pouring out her story in her heart to me. And I'm thinking, I'm going to encourage her to do what God has already put on her heart to do, break this off, and we're going to support her, Nancy and I, as best we can. She can call us in the middle of the night. We can, we'll make a special effort just to walk alongside her. And I could kind of picture a 6 or 9 month journey of where at the end of that, okay, life goes on, right? That's what I imagine. And I thought, that's what I can do. Maybe that's what I'm supposed to do. But I also thought, Lord, if you have something to say, if you want to enter this conversation, that was new to me. Would you actually step into this conversation right now that she and I are having, full of tears in this office? Would you enter into that conversation now? So I said to her, we're just going to take a minute and just kind of listen, So I closed my eyes. I didn't want, just to be staring at her. And I closed my eyes and I said, Lord, what would you have us do? What would you want? And, with my mind closed, or my eyes closed, you have kind of the screen of your imagination right there. And on the screen, I see this necklace, like a piece of jewelry. And I think, man, is it Nancy? Have I missed Nancy's birthday? Have I been looking at too many Zales catalogs? Like, I couldn't imagine why I was seeing a necklace, and I thought, oh, I am so terrible at this. And then so I erased it, it's like, give it another shot. Lord, do you have anything to say right now about this? And I see the necklace again. Now I'm thinking it's the pink elephant. Do not think of a pink elephant, and all I can do, think of a pink elephant. And so I can't shake it. And one more time, just feeling so terrible at this. And I said, Lord, do you have anything to say? And there I actually see the, what the pendant is, it's very detailed. And I just think, can that be you, Lord? Mm-hmm. Is that you? And you may not like this, but I felt the Lord said to me, good guess, dummy. That's what I felt. Good guess, dummy. And, I said, what could that possibly mean? And as soon as I did that, as soon as I asked that question, like what could, silently in my heart, what could that possibly mean? It was like, he's given her a necklace, right. She's wearing it now. If she'll take the necklace off and give it to you as a symbol of her willingness to obey me, then I will take the emotional yoke of this off of her right now. So I looked at her, trying to look for the necklace, right? Can't see it, it's got a turtleneck on. I said, hey, are you wearing a necklace? She's thinking, why are you asking me that? She said, yeah. I said, could I see it? So she pulls it out. It's the necklace I see.
Come on.
So I said, here's the deal. The Lord says if you'll take that off and give it to me, and you got to know I'm going to throw it away. I don't know what it's worth, but I'm going to throw it away. Like I'm not just going to take it home and give it to my daughter or something. I'm going to throw it away. And if you're willing for that to happen, then the Lord's going to take this off of you. And she didn't know, right? So she, with trembling hands and tear-filled eyes, took that necklace off and handed it to me. And the Lord touched her. She just kind of fell back. And first time I ever saw someone kind of laugh, like they were being tickled.
Yeah.
And I thought, I was kind of listening closely because, like I just was at my neurologist yesterday, and every time I go, because I've had a stroke, and they're, hopefully try and help me not to have more. And every time you go, you got to fill out this long neurological kind of thing, like what's happening to you. And one of the categories is you have uncontrolled laughter. It's a psychotic condition, right? Like, so I was listening closely for like, was this that I've crossed the line? I'm over the, I'm not in touch. But it sounded so healing.
Right.
And so this went on for just a little bit, and then she kind of sat back up and looked at me with like bright eyes and said, let's call him.
Wow.
It was over.
So good.
Not that she didn't still long to be married and have a child, and the heartbreak of dreams, delayed dreams. I mean, all of that was still true. But the link with this wrong relationship that I thought at best, maybe 9 months, we'll get towards the end of that, the Lord did. So she left my office smiling, and I began to weep. Mm-hmm. Because I thought, how many times have I never even asked the question?
Right.
Do you have anything you want to say, Lord?
Yeah.
So to me, follow the way of love.
Right.
It's about loving people that we know we don't know, and at least having an open heart to say, God, do you have something you want to contribute that comes from you, and not just, a lot of times it's just our experience, our wisdom, the Lord trying to fuel our compassion. I'm not saying that in every case, we now have the key, but sometimes the Lord wants to step into the conversation through us in a way that's powerful. Okay, so that's all background for talking about some things that I think will be helpful, will be familiar to you. But but these are the things I've learned. So my history after those being in Vancouver was that my friend Mike Bickle asked us to come. We actually spent 1985 here in California with John in Yorba Linda, and then helped Blaine plant his church in Lake Forest, Blaine Cook, in the first kind of half of 1986. And then Mike, my friend, said, come back and help me. I got this church, I got these prophetic people, and help me do that. So I was there for a number of years. I was there when Kansas City became part of the Vineyard. I traveled extensively with all of the so-called Kansas City prophets, Paul Cain, Bob Jones, John Paul Jackson, Larry Randolph, you name it. I was kind of the B team for John, traveling internationally. Like, soccer has like the first division, second division, third division. Well, like in those days when John would travel, he would like have these things where leaders could come and be prayed for. And so like first division was like Paul Cain, and third division was Brent Rue and I, like in a room, prophesying over leaders. So my history is I've seen everything. I don't know if everything is accurate, but I've seen a lot. I've seen a lot of wonderful things. I've seen a lot of terrible things. And so I'm going to speak out of that history. I'm not here to retell that history, but I'm here to speak what I've learned out of that history. Okay, so here's, if you want to write anything down, you can use those notes that talk about listening and responding. 8 critical parts of the listening, responding journey. First one is really understanding God's will. Understanding God's will. And by that I mean both understanding kind of His good and please, this idea that what is the will of God? That it comes out of this desire for a loving, trust-filled relationship. So the will of God is not to make you great or wealthy or powerful. The will of God is not to conquer kingdoms through you necessarily. I mean, I'm talking about the will that rules all other wills. That the will of God is ultimately about serving, faith expressing itself through love in your life, and that will is discovered in a way that, well, I understand it as clarity-cost equation. There's a clarity-cost equation. The greater the clarity, the greater the cost.
Wow.
So if you know very specifically the will of God, of what you're supposed to do, there is likely to be a significant cost to that. That's why you know very clearly that it's God's will. When I sat, Brent Rue, when he was sick, asked me to come back from England and consider, I know he also asked Carl to consider his church there in Lancaster, and I'd been there a few times with Bob Jones and with John Paul, and so I knew the church, and Brent and I were friends mostly from traveling. But we thought, okay, I love you, Brent. I'm going to come and look at it. We went, and I remember your words exactly, Carl, about the Antelope Valley. You said it was butt ugly. That was your terminology. That was your spiritual kind of perception. Lancaster and Cogdale. You said, oh, that place is just butt ugly. And of course, it's a unique place in that we're on the northeast corner of LA County. And it has all of the problems of the urban core in this high desert, weird setting. So the gangs, the drugs, the violence, the poverty, it's all there, but it's out there on the edge in this, in the land where couches last 1,000 years when they're abandoned by the side of the road.
That's a great revelation.
Yeah, it is. So it's initially, especially, it's kind of a shocking. And my friends would think about me like, where should David be? he should be in an urban setting near university. You know, that those are my people, right? And so Lancaster, you know, like very particularly our church had a big heart for the poor. Well, I've always said our church is of the poor, not, we don't have a ministry to the poor. We're a church of the poor. So it just seemed like not a fit, you know. My initial experience was like, I don't think this is a fit. I came down and met with John and Carol during that trip in 1990, early 1993. And I met with John and Carol and I said, I'm not doing this. This isn't for me. And they said, great, you know, what do you want to do? We want to help you do that, you know. And so I don't know for sure what I want to do, but I'm not doing this. And that was like on a Friday, and then I go back up there for the weekend. I wasn't going to speak there. I was just there to meet people, take a look at things. Brent calls me on Saturday night and says he was battling cancer. He said, I'm really feeling terrible. Would you mind speaking at the service? I said, no, I'll be glad to. So now I'm speaking at the service Sunday morning. Well, unbeknownst to anyone, that night, a man, father, husband in the church, 2 little children. He'd gone to the ATM machine on Lancaster Boulevard. It's a very famous sexual case because it caused banks to have to change where they put ATM machines. The ATM machine was behind the bank in an alley in Lancaster Boulevard.
No
He
way.
went there at 10 p.m. at night to get $20 out of the ATM, and somebody came up behind him and shot him in the head and killed him for $20.
Nuts.
Now this is a family in the church everybody knew and loved, and so that news spread like wildfire. Through, you know, shocked and grieved the church unimaginably. So I'm told this on the way to church on Sunday morning. I'm thinking, wow. Like they don't even have anybody who's going to like lead the service. I'm going to like lead the service. I'm going to speak. I have to address this. I'm ticked now. I mean, I'm really heartbroken for the people, but I'm thinking, why did I ever agree to come?
Right.
Like, this is so inappropriate, you know, that they would have a guest, like, standing in this place at this time. All through worship, I'm complaining to the Lord, why did I come? Like, I really missed it. Like, you know, I'm not, you know, this is just bad. I'm going to do my best, but I just want to register in heaven. This is bad. Like, this needs to go on my positive column where I did hard things for the kingdom. You know, I want this noted, you know, like, and I'm complaining like that, and then God says, you know, like, the reason you're here is because you're their pastor.
No.
But ugly. I really needed to know that very clearly.
Yes, you did.
Yeah.
To move my family from London to Lancaster. To embrace a church. You know, I did a conference this summer for an Asian American church here in Orange County. There were about 1,000 folks total there. 95% college degrees or above.
Right.
95%. There were more doctors and lawyers than I'd ever been around at one time in my life. Our church had about 10% with college degrees, and a whole lot, a majority, not even having high school diplomas. And again, like I love that. I love what I spent the last 25 years doing. But I needed to know that this was God's will for me, because it was going to be hard.
Right.
It was going to be hard. God's a father. He's a parent who loves us. No wonder there's a clarity-cost equation. And here's the good news. When you don't have clarity, that's not a bad thing. When you don't have clarity, it means there's lots of options. And there's probably lots of grace for those options.
Wow.
So this idea that somehow gets in people's mind that I need God to tell me what breakfast cereal to eat in the morning. Like, well, Lord have mercy. You don't eat that and you're judged. That's not the relationship He wants with you. He gives you enough clarity to handle the cost. Okay? Right, second thing. Finding your eager desire. That's what 1 Corinthians 14 says, right? So Acts 2, when the Spirit is poured out at the day of Pentecost, Peter cites Joel 2. This is it. God's pouring out His Spirit. The end result is going to be a prophetic people. So fast forward to Paul writing in 1 Corinthians 14 to the Corinthian church, and he says to them, follow the way of love, eagerly desire spiritual gifts. There's an eager desire that's involved in this, especially the gift of prophecy, especially the ability to hear, listen, respond, and act on God's behalf, that this is something that you ought to have a keen desire for, an eager desire for. Now, that's essential because, like growing up in whatever God has for you in that is like, again, it's not easy. So I needed personally something like that encounter I told you about with a friend that I really cared about, and see how, witnessed how helpful that was to her, that I actually tried to have a desire to hear so that the outcome would be like that. So we're fueled, hopefully, in that eager desire by our desire to love others, to love them effectively, to want to offer whatever gifts that we do have in a way that's going to benefit them. Where this gets complicated is that I've come to discover and believe that desire is also the greatest distorter of revelation. So somehow you've got to have the right kind of desire for the gifts, and then understand how vulnerable you are for desire to twist and distort and warp what you might hear or receive. It's the reason that, desire, the distortion of desire is the reason why if you're a surgeon and you're smart, you don't operate on your children. Because your perspective is altered by your desire for a certain outcome. Now, this weighs in on our life in a way personally that's really important, in that we have to understand that the things that we deeply desire, that they can twist revelation. So I'll be very personal and vulnerable. There's a whole bunch of people who don't want me to die. That's their desire. God bless them. I have cancer and I'm supposed to die, from it, and they love me. And their desire is I not die. And that's mine as well. But I don't believe a one of them that says to me, you're going to live and not die. I heard so many people tell Brent he was going to live and not die. It's not wrong, it's not evil, it's not malicious, it's just people speaking out of their eager desire. And, here's one. A young person comes to you and says, man, the Lord told me I'm going to marry that one.
Well, that's a see you later.
I say, really, that one? Do you know her? No, not yet. Does she like you? No. I said, yeah, that, could be God, like Hosea.
Yeah.
Like clarity cost, like could be. But honestly, if you just really want to be married, watch out. Like your desire will twist your sense of God's leading in your life. You have to really check yourself. That's why we need one another so much. That I don't just let my desire dictate God's voice in my life. but I do have to have a desire to be God's voice for others.
Sure you do.
You know, so somehow I have to juggle and manage it that I have the right kind of eager desire. Now, what's helped me tremendously is that my eager desire gets focused on loving them and loving God, because it's a loving thing to respond and represent God in some way. Like every time I speak, I'm a classic introvert, and like most people, public speaking would have been my number one fear. And so in many ways, even all these years later, it's a sacrifice for me. And I'm always saying to the Lord before I do it, this is for you. Like, this is my loving response to you, that I'm doing this that, maybe it's not my favorite thing. Like, it's love. Like, so my target can't be, I want this result. Like, that can't be my eager desire. Like, here's the outcome I want, therefore that's what's going to fuel, my prophecy. No, it's got to back off from that, because if it's just, this is the outcome I want, that desire will distort and twist whatever God actually wants to give you and what He wants you to contribute. Okay? That makes sense?
Yeah.
All right, we'll keep on. Where are we at? We're doing good. Overcoming insecurity and pride. Wow. I've been around some really gifted people. People who know stuff, like detailed stuff, that they have no way of knowing. Just like, wow. Like, how do you get that? I have had a few really good moments. Some of my best moments was Mike Pilavachi brought a 14 or 15-year-old kid from the youth group at St. Andrews when we were living in England. He brought him to my house, said, Mike said, David, I want you to pray for my friend. This kid couldn't even look me, and he was so shy, so inward, just sat there on the couch, looked down, and I thought, okay, I don't know, what would the Lord how would He have me pray for him? I put my hands on him, I started to pray, and the Lord said he's a father of worship leaders.
Come on.
Wow.
It was Matt Redman.
Yeah.
He's 14 years old.
Come on.
That's,
It's a good day.
yeah, it was a good day. But I've been around people who know, your street address when you were 3 years old. But I'll tell you what ruins that. I'll tell you what makes that kind of gifting come to nothing. It's two things primarily. One is a misshapen personal identity, and the other is a misshapen theology. And that's why this afternoon we're going to talk about our life in God's Word and securing a foundation that's not misshapen, that our ideas about who God is and what He's doing don't undermine the gifting that He would express in our life. But it's also this sense of identity, right? Who am I? And it's always a huge danger sign when we start identifying ourselves by our gifting. It's just a huge danger sign. And so that's why I've never been a fan of the, let's call these offices, I'm this, I'm that, or even pastors are so prone to this. I'm a pastor. We had consultants come in during the time that we were transitioning our church to new leadership. Jonathan Root, Brent's son, is the new lead pastor of the church that I've led for 25 years. It's really kind of a wonderful, only the Lord could twist it that way kind of story. But we had consultants came in, and one of their real concerns is, David, pastors tend to so wrap their identity. I'm a pastor. Now, what am I if I'm not a pastor? Mm-hmm. And I said to them, you don't have to worry about me. I never wanted to be a pastor. So this is not going to be a problem. It's not going to be I don't know who I am now. because people tend to identify themselves by their gifts. I don't know if you're highly gifted prophetically, this is the worst possible, like those people tend to think of themselves as prophets. And that twists your identity. And it twists it in really unhelpful ways in terms of what the gift is actually going to produce. Because you and I, in our worst self, we're ruled by some kind of combination of insecurity and pride. In order to have any kind of equilibrium in life, you have to manage it. I've always pictured it myself as like a I don't even know if they still have these in parks anymore, like a seesaw or teeter-totter, a board on a fulcrum with maybe a couple of handles, and you get on it with another person, hopefully roughly your weight, and you go back and forth, back and forth. Well, when I was a kid, and going through a park, cutting through a park or whatever, there's one of those, I'd always run up one side, the downside of it, and then try to balance it personally, myself, by distributing my weight kind of equally on either side to bring the teeter-totter kind of level, right? That's how most people try to get their equilibrium in life. They have to have some kind of balance that enables them to function. So what they do is that they kind of are shoring up their pride to counterbalance their insecurity. And so whenever you're dealing with someone you think, wow, they're super prideful and arrogant. Well, I guarantee you, underneath that shell, they're super insecure. Or you see someone just massively insecure. I guarantee you if they're functional. There's a lot of people non-functional. Like they've fallen off the teeter-totter. Like their institutions are full of people who think they're Napoleon or Jesus or they've fallen off so far on the pride side, like their life simply doesn't work. And then there are also people who fall off on the insecurity side and they just are unable to function. So anyone who's functioning has found some kind of balance between those two things.
Wow.
And so a really insecure person will have some deep pockets of pride in their life. Now, as Christians, those two things are both false.
Yeah.
Pride is, I can do it myself. You can't. Insecurity is, I have no one to help me. You do. So both of those things are false. They have to be repented of. Mm-hmm. They have to be put to death in our life. Both insecurity and pride. Now, for a Christian, the two things that allow us to have healthy equilibrium are somewhat like those things, but in opposite directions. The two things that we need to have are dependence and confidence.
Good.
Right? So Paul will say about himself, I'm the chief among sinners. Like if there's anyone who needs God's mercy, I'm in the front of the line. So that's a healthy kind of dependence, sense of self. But he will also say, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. A profound sense of confidence. So the interesting thing is you would think, wow, arrogance or pride and confidence, they kind of look like parallel tracks. So you just have to move off one track to another. That's not the way that it works, actually. Pride has to become dependence. And insecurity has to become confidence. So again, that's why Paul says, when I'm weak, then I'm strong. So we find our confidence in places that we're insecure. And we find our dependence in those places that we would tempted to be proud about. If we don't, if we end up just, when the wind blows, like, it's one thing to balance the teeter-totter, on a really quiet day. It's a whole other thing to balance that thing in a thunderstorm or in a tornado. Life's a tornado sometimes, and if you're balancing pride and insecurity, it won't work. And ministry is a tornado, and so what I've seen from really gifted people is their distorted sense of self. Pride will just massively ruin good revelation, good and insecurity as well. The guy, I'll say his name because I love him. He's no longer living. But the guy who said to me, you have a parrot on your shoulder you're trying to get off. Or no, the Lord, you're not a parrot. You're a voice and not an echo. His name was Augustine Akala. And Augustine had lots of problems. And he, the interesting thing was that he was so insecure inside that if he did not know you, like our first encounter, we became somewhat of friends. But if he didn't know you, that was the healthiest time you would ever encounter him. Because as soon as he got to know you, he would try to manipulate you. But if he had no knowledge of you, he didn't care. And so insecurity, like I was a lifeguard, as a teenager, and you learn to don't let the person drown you when you're saving them.
Good.
They'll clutch and grab onto you. In insecurity, we'll do a lot of desperate things. And when that's hidden inside and you're using your gift to do those desperate things, to prove yourself or to get people to need you, it really turns sick and ugly. And in very downhill way. If I'm using you in pride just to be like notches on my belt, I would, because I became a Christian from a kind of non-Christian background, I really wanted evangelism to be part of my life. And I did everything, we did the Here's Life campaign, I went door to door, I did things, I would witness to people on public transport. And I realized one day that I was doing it for me, not for them. I was doing it so I could feel good about, hey, I witnessed today. I felt sick about that inside. I thought, oh my gosh. It was all about me. It was all about pride. It had nothing to do with kind of the genuine, and God can use, donkeys, right? So He can use us in our pride and insecurity if He is so gracious. But for us, that's no long-term solution. That's no sustainable place. And with listening and responding to God, if it's running through our jungle of insecurities and pockets of pride, it's going to be messed up. And that's not to say you start from you can only be really healthy. I'm just telling you what you want to steer towards. You want the goal to be, I'm coming from a good place, that I have my confidence and dependence in Christ. That I know I'm not alone because He's with me, and I know that I desperately need Him, and apart from Him, nothing good is going to come. And when I'm in that place, then I'm in the best place for things to happen in a fruitful way. Where are we at? When did we start? So about an hour ago. Why don't we take a break for about 5 minutes, a little more. If you need to stretch, whatever, we'll take a break. We'll come back to it, okay? Does anybody want to ask a question or make a comment thus far what we're talking about? Anything need clarity or anything you want to add to what we've been saying?
Thank you.
Doing okay?
That's great stuff. Thank you.
That's very kind.
Why didn't I know some of this stuff after all these years?
I know.
Slow down. So you needed like another half hour to get to your chair?
Oh, boy.
You need to slow down?
Trying to say something so wrong.
You're just like God.
It's too wide to be, I think.
You're not.
In the back could fold up.
I was going to say something else, but I love Carl. We've been friends a very long time. He's done some really mean things to me. Like really mean. But I've weathered all that. I've returned some of it in kind.
Yes.
But I love it. You know, when I think of Carl's voice, you know, just like some people's voices, you know, like when I hear Carl now, you know, of course, 20 years ago, I used to think of songs or, you know, that kind of thing. And I hear Carl's voice now, I think of perspective and kind of wisdom and that's been won in a hard way. I love that. I love that about his voice, you know, that he's speaking out of a really important place, a tender place, a hard place. And yeah, so I'm saying very nice. Okay. Good. All right. If no one has a question or wants us to pause for a second about something, we'll press on. Yes.
I just want to say thank you so much. I feel like a sponge. All that you're saying is so timely and is amazing.
Good.
Thank you for paying the price to speak this.
Yeah. You're welcome. You're welcome. Well, that's going to come up in a minute. We're on the fourth point of the 8 critical parts of the listening, responding journey. We're about learning the veiled language. I made that joke about how I said to God, you know, if you'd write on people, I'd read it. I can read, you know, and that just has never happened to me. I assume it's happened to some people sometimes, but in general, the language that God communicates by His Spirit, you know, something that He wants you to hear, to know, to respond to act on, to pray about, that language is a veiled language. And we can complain all we want about God not writing on people, but this is His choice.
Right.
That He has chosen to speak in veiled ways. This comes out kind of most clearly back to that Numbers 12 passage, you know, where, you know, Moses has followed God's instructions to call the elders together. The Spirit's fallen on them. Some of them didn't make the meeting. It fell on them anyway. They were out amongst the people. They prophesied out there. That's how everybody knew what was going on. They all get upset because Moses is our guy. Moses is our prophet. And they send poor Joshua to be their spokesperson to tell Moses, cut these people off, you know, shut them down. And that's when Moses said, are you jealous for my sake? You know, I long that all of God's people were prophets.
That's good.
But then, you know, Aaron and Miriam get all bent out of shape because, hey, you know, we've been doing this and now we're getting like no credit, no acknowledgement, and they start grumbling. I think it's just a fascinating, Numbers 11 and 12. You know, in terms of the perception of people's psychology, about how people work. You know, in Numbers 11, you have Moses in the depths of despair over how difficult it is to lead people and to lead them into something new, to lead them into real life. And he despairs about his own failure. It's so relatable, so telling. But here at the beginning of Numbers 12, you have Aaron and Miriam, and they're hurt. They're hurt by the people's response and the kind of the elevation of Moses, and they're jealous and whatever else is going on. But you know how they attack Moses? His marriage. Wow. I just find that interesting.
Yeah.
You know, like, he married, you know, that woman, and I mean, that's how they attack him. And then, this is, you know, like a warning. You know, and then the Lord gets mad. He says, we're going to have a little meeting together.
Wow, yeah.
And he asks Aaron and Miriam this really hard question: why were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? He says, when I speak to a prophet, I speak to him in visions and dreams, but when I speak to Moses, I speak to him face to face, not in riddles.
So good.
See here, so Moses is different than everybody else, right? He gets face-to-face communication with God. Everybody else, prophets that God has, he speaks to them in riddles. Difference. Moses said, there will be one like me who comes from his brothers.
Come on.
Jesus. We got Moses, Jesus, then everybody else. Jesus above Moses. Everybody else. So you and I, we aren't getting it face to face, clearly, and not in riddles. We're getting it in riddles. What are riddles? Things that have to be figured out. Things that are not as apparent as we would like them to be. Things that require sorting and sifting and interpreting and applying. So, veiled language. This riddle-like communication that comes from God. The main identifiers of this language biblically, it's almost like that they're a reference to a whole category of communication, and that's dreams and visions. Joel mentions dreams and visions. Job mentions dreams and visions. Numbers 12. So we're talking about those are maybe like the two most outstanding examples of riddle-like communication. But that's not the only riddle-like communication. We have thoughts and impressions. We have experiences and circumstances. They would all fall under that similar kind of thing. But dreams and visions are the most outstanding examples of riddle-like communication. So let's take an example like dreams. Dreams are bizarre. Dreams are, from as best that we can understand, and there's been a lot of research poured into dreams in the last 50 years, and it seems the general consensus is that our capacity as human beings to dream is tied up with the subconscious and its ability to be refreshed. So your dreams are a process that is being utilized by your subconscious to cleanse things out of your life. So all those dreams that you have about showing up for a test naked, or whatever the imagery is of the dream that we tend to have repetitively in our life, this is, if I could put it as blunt as this is the toilet bowl of the subconscious flushing away.
Revelation.
Some things are hard to flush away. And so they happen again and again and again. So, a system that is meant to take things out of your life, to refresh or to cleanse your life, God chooses to put in your life.
Come on.
So it's kind of like you come over to my house, you say, David, I'm really thirsty. Could you get me a cup of water? And I scoop it out of the toilet and I say, here you go.
Hallelujah.
And you go, ooh. That's what it's like. Huh? You have done that to you? That's not true. That should have been true. Especially after you made me pick up dog poop. But it's not true. Yeah. So the fact that God chooses a vehicle He created for elimination in your life to bring something to your life, this is an interesting choice. I'm just saying to you that both are by God's design, and it's interesting.
Yeah.
Because it immediately puts dreams in the categories of, is that out or in? And most, again, here's what statistics say. People have 6 to 7 dream episodes in their sleep at night. I don't know about you. I don't remember. I remember vividly one from last night. But I'm sure, like most dreams, it's to be shrugged off. And that's ultimately how you'll discover a dream that's supposed to come in, is it won't be able to shrug off. Like some dreams just have a weight to them. They won't go away. Most you just toss the bucket out. Say, oh, I don't know what that was. That was weird. And who knows what my subconscious is doing. But some just want to get in there. But even so, a dream that has weight to it, you think, maybe there's something here to this dream. Now it has to be figured out.
Right.
And it seems as though, because the subconscious is involved, that dreams are heavily weighted towards emotional language, like the emotion of it, the how we perceive. But and not to say that details are unimportant, but they often are representative. Like, that someone who's an authority figure or beloved or trusted appears in your dream, and possibly are they, because of how you feel towards them, are they representing the God part of this message? Who knows, right? But here's an example of how this works is that Gideon, he has this the story of Gideon. He's got to try to liberate Israel, and he can only use a few people to do it, and he's understandably anxiety ridden about it. And God says, well, if you're so worried about it, go down. It's the middle of the night. Go down and listen to what they're saying in the camp of your enemy. So he sneaks down there, and he comes up next to a tent, and one guy wakes up and tells his friend, I just had the worst dream. A big round barley loaf rolled down the hill and squashed our tent. Now that's a dream. That is a dream right there. The big loaf of bread bounced down the hill and squashed the tent.
Of course, everyone knows the thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's it can only mean one thing, Gideon says. We're going to win. That's what the friend tells the friend. We're going to get crushed in this battle. And Gideon goes away, wow, I'm encouraged. The big round barley loaf encouraged me. Riddle-like communication.
Wow.
Right? Images, visions. We'd love them to be just unveiled reality, like seeing the future or whatever. Very rarely. They are, again, what does that mean? What is that? My vision of the necklace. What is that? Why am I seeing it? What does it represent? It has to be, there's a riddle to it that has to be unfolded. And our great confidence is that if God is communicating, that He's going to help us unfold the riddle of it, or as much as we need to. Because, the first part of that unfolding is I got to interpret what it is that I'm seeing or hearing or experiencing or feeling. And then, having interpreted it, I have to now make a decision about what does God want me to do with that. Is this simply to inform my prayers? Is this to stimulate my, having a conversation? But it's that communication of just the expectation. So for me, being such a reader and words and all of that, of course, what I think happens is that God develops a unique vocabulary with each of us. It's not the same. So I shouldn't have been surprised. I'd never see God write on anybody. I think that He tends to develop a very specific vocabulary with you, and anything that involves intimacy, over time you get shortcuts in a vocabulary with someone you know very well. That's what initially it's our grandchildren. We have a couple of grandsons who are one's one and one's going to turn one, and so language, they're on the cusp of language, and man, it's all a struggle, getting that first word and then putting words together and all that kind of stuff, and it's wow, but then Nancy and I have been married for 41 years. Thank you, honey, for that one. 41, and there's a lot of shortcuts in our communication.
Yeah.
Right? So for me, I thought, wow, words, no. I see pictures. I have
That's interesting.
physical sensations. Just not at all in my comfort zone. But that's, over time, you recognize, well, that's how the Lord taps on my life. And not that He couldn't do it in other ways, had an occasional dream, but in general, over time, there'll be a consistency. There'll be a consistency that enables kind of a more rapid movement from interpretation to application in those things. Okay? All right. Number 5, embracing the cost of maturity. You got to pay the price for growing up. And nobody can do it for you. And this is part of our frustration with spiritual gifts in general. That we would like them to come in a mature form. Like just drop on us and wow, we can use them. But they don't happen like that. They are spiritually sourced abilities and callings and qualities, and they have to be grown. They have to be developed. And we have to pay the price for that development. Some of the things that have to do with prophecy have been really unhelpful for paying the price. What happens is that in our growing up, of course, we don't do everything right. We don't handle everything well. Some things we make a mess of. But if you're doing that with prophecy, because God's on, it's like gifts with a check mark. It's like gifts with trump cards on them. Suddenly it's like God says. So that you've just moved totally out of, whatever. If you're a teacher, it's still you saying it, even if you're claiming some teaching that's not true. But what prophecy is like, God's like on the line, and so it's really an unhelpful model. This idea that if you're going to prophesy, that you prophesy in such a way that imposes and kind of claims something that is not necessarily true. So, thus saith the Lord. That model of, I'm just speaking on God's behalf, and that's the way it ought to be done. Well, I think it can be helpfully done that way if that is in fact what's happening.
Right.
But if you're in the process of growth, and you're a mixture of something, and you're doing it that way, you're not being helpful. You're making somebody else pay the price of your growing up. You've just said, thus saith the Lord, and it might be half the Lord and half you, or none of the Lord, and they just now have landed on them, and they have to decide, are you an absolute idiot, or are you, the voice piece of God? And that's just completely unfair.
It is unfair.
It is. It's just completely unfair. So the best way, rather than kind of impose or control, is to offer and ask. You want to learn to pay the price for listening to God is, I think I have something, so I offer to them. Does this mean anything to you? Do you have a necklace?
That's good.
Offer and ask. I've gone up to strangers that I felt I had a word for. I've had some painful lessons of maturity. I've had some of those, wow, was that God? I went up to some stranger and told them something, and boo-hoo-hoo, boo-hoo-hoo, and we had this wonderful follow-up conversation, and wasn't that fantastic? And I've had some of the most embarrassing moments of my life, going up to somebody and saying something that was completely off. But what's mitigated that embarrassment, and that for them at least, if not for me, was offering and asking versus trying to impose and pronounce. Right? And here's the great thing about it. I have never, something that's God you can't lessen the power of.
Yeah.
Really. You can't. It's like you can be as humble, I don't know if this means anything, and then kaboom! It's like, it's really God, and it really has weight, and it doesn't matter how humbly or deferentially you offered it, kaboom! And it doesn't matter how much you build it up. We used to call it, in the Kansas City days, that people added hamburger helper to their prophecies. It wasn't really meat, it was something, but it made it seem like more than it was. So no matter how vehemently you say, thus saith the Lord, if it's not the Lord, it's going to... So there's no downside to this, what I'm saying. Is, like, you really got something going from the Lord to give someone, it won't take away from it. To act like, I don't know, what do you think? Cost of maturity. No presuming, no imposing. Testing the spirits. This is the one clear place in the New Testament where we're given some kind of filtering key about how to tell something that's come from God from something that hasn't come from God. And I don't know if images help you, but the image I have in my mind is the way that water comes into our house. For us in the high desert, we they take groundwater, they take, the concrete river, the aqueduct that comes from the Sierras, they take water out of that. It goes into treatment plants. First of all, initially when the water is taken from its source, like out of the aqueduct, there's a lot of fish in there, There's a lot of tumbleweeds, there's a lot of car tires, there's a lot of debris in there. First, you got to get the big parts out first, so there's some kind of, screen in the intake that is, filtering out the big logs and the debris and that kind of stuff. And then gradually, as the process goes on, there's a smaller and smaller filtering of things. So I always imagine 1 John 4 talking about like a series of screens. Here's some of the screens that are in place that help us to capture the things that can't be God. Okay, so you familiar with the 1 John? Let me just read it for us, just so we're on the same page together. 1 John 4. John says, "Dear friends, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they're from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world." Let me stop for a second and say that John is using the word spirit here. Spirit can be used both in Greek and Hebrew. The idea of spirit means breath or wind, or in the case of God creation, even disembodied beings, personalities, right? So there's this wide range in the usage of those words, from everything from this idea of something that comes from the center of your life, that you breathe in or breathe out, to an actual person who doesn't have physical form. So John is using here in 1 John 4 the non-personal way of speaking of spirit. So he's not talking about some personality, some demon or angel that you're testing. He's talking about testing the spirit of something, where it comes from, the center of it. What's at the center of it? That's really critical to know where it's from. Like, what's the center of this? So the very first thing that John says about, and he says this, you need to do this because many false prophets are in the world. Many people are speaking things as coming from the center of God's heart or mind or will that are not that. And so they need to be caught in the screens and filtered out. So here's the first screen that he throws up in 1 John. This is how you can recognize the Spirit of God. Every spirit that acknowledges that Jesus has come in the flesh is from God. But every spirit that does not acknowledge Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard is coming, and even now is already in the world. So the first screen is this confession, this center that Jesus has come in the flesh. Now, requires a little unpacking, because as much as I've traveled and spoken about things prophetic, I've had countless conversations with someone afterwards who comes up and looks at me really seriously and says, confess that Jesus Christ came in the flesh. They think that my verbal acknowledging of that is somehow like the application of this test. I mean, it's good that they discover that I'm an Orthodox Christian, but what he's talking about is something very, very particular to what was going on in the first century. And that has to do with something called Gnosticism. Gnosis is the Greek word for knowledge. And Gnosticism was a prevailing kind of perspective that had invaded religion and philosophy, that basically said that the key to life was secret gnosis, secret knowledge, and the access to that knowledge would elevate your life, kind of give you the life that you were meant to have. So John is saying something very particular here. He's saying that the life that you're meant to have comes from the person and the work and the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus, not some secret bit of information. It must confess that life comes from Jesus,
Right.
identifying with us our broken humanity, giving his life for our brokenness, and being raised for our redemption. So this idea, in the first century there would have been Gnostic Christians who would have denied that Jesus was material at all, that was like irrelevant, that he came to impart secret information, special knowledge, and that special knowledge was saving to you. And so John is saying it's not knowledge that's saving, it's Jesus that's saving.
Come on.
And so this is very, very important when it comes to prophecy, because prophecy is dealing with knowledge and can be offered as special knowledge that's redemptive. And it is as much a problem today as it was in the first century. I think that most of kind of the self-help books that you'd find in Barnes & Noble or on Amazon are peddling an idea that this special information is going to be saving in your life. I think that Christians peddle this. I appreciate people who have faith and want healing for others, but it's not a word of knowledge that produces healing. So I don't say, hey, you got this and you're healed. It's Jesus that heals. You see, the subtle slope of attaching to information this special power, the power of life, that's deadly. That's Gnosticism. And John is saying the first filter that we filter out is anything that's not coming from a core, that Jesus is our redemptive key. He's our redemptive one. That it's relationship and knowing him that is saving. And information serves that, of course, but it doesn't substitute that. And that's why he says, and this is so important that I'm sure you all know this already, but Antichrist in the Greek does not mean against Christ. No. Like this is against, that's fairly easy to identify. The things that are absolutely hate Jesus. Anti in Greek means instead of, in place of. Antichrist means the one that wants to take the place of Jesus, and this idea that somehow special knowledge will do it, wants to take the place of Jesus, and John says that should be rejected as not the Spirit of God, but the spirit of falsehood. It's coming from a false place. It needs to be filtered out. And secondly,
He says, you dear children are from God and have overcome them. He's talking about, these false prophets in the world. You've overcome them because the one who's in you is greater than the one who's in the world. They are from the world and therefore speak from the viewpoint of the world, and the world listens to them. There's the second filter, the viewpoint of the world. Now we would all have to decide what that is. What's the viewpoint of the world? But having some idea about that ought to be helpful. So something, for instance, that would come towards me, that would appeal to my pride, that would flatter me, or, at the height of, our traveling in Kansas City, we attended a meeting, you and I, attended a meeting where the nations of the world were being handed out.
Oh, yeah.
Like, you're going to be the apostle of India. That's kind of flattering. Right? Wow, God would have me be like, But if I had any sense of the viewpoint of the world, I'd probably be suspicious of that. Had a guy, we once had a meeting in Kansas City, we had a meeting, this other Pentecostal prophetic, well-known prophetic guy comes in, and we're talking. He says to me, he starts prophesying to me how God was going to give me a Rolls Royce and a Rolex and all of that. And all the while, I'm just going like this to him. In my heart, I'm just thinking, like, I'm a Ronald Sider guy. I don't even know what you're talking about. For someone that might be attractive, but it's attractive in a worldly way. And I'm uninterested. Like, you might think, you missed out on a chance, an opportunity for a blessing. No. I was just, had my screens in place. Like, I got caught up when we lived in England. There was this famous thing that an Anglican vicar, and I was doing most of my traveling and teaching in Anglican churches, but an Anglican vicar, I don't know how old they were, maybe he was in his late 30s or early 40s, but he felt like the Lord had told him his wife was going to die and he was to marry her best friend. She wasn't sick.
Piece of work.
It went, got on all the, the tabloid, it became a big story in England. This guy has told his church, told his wife's preparing to die. She's getting her stuff in order, right? Like, so I had some people who knew this guy, and they said, would you call him and talk to him, And so I tried to call him. He wouldn't talk to me. What would I have said? Your desire to have her best friend as your wife is a worldly, ugly thing. And it is twisted. Whatever you think you heard should have been filtered out by the worldliness of the message. No matter how you thought, wow, this is supernatural, just sad. They got divorced. She's still alive. Yeah. Okay. Second one. The third one. We are from God. Whoever knows God listens to us. I love this one. But whoever is not from God does not listen to us. This is how we recognize the spirit of truth and the spirit of falsehood. This is either the most arrogant statement ever written down, or it's true. We are from God. Whoever is from God listens to us. Who's the we? It's the apostles. So there's a claim for apostolic authority that overrules individual kind of revelation. So the Bible, what are the criterion for the biblical books? In the Old Testament is that they have to be attached to a prophetic voice. So you have the prophet in the Old Testament, and the criteria for the New Testament books, they have to be attached to apostolic authority, that they're the work of an apostle. So, that's the word. It has to listen to us. And so there's this filter of, is it contradicting? Is it, obviously some things would be clear, other things not as clear. But the things that would be clear ought to be clear. We ought to know them. I hear explanations for things sometimes that just break my heart. That people try to give explanation for some experience or thing that's happened to them or is happening to others, and their explanation is so profoundly unbiblical. It's so profoundly false. Like during the height of Toronto days, I heard someone teach that the reason why God was laying out people for long periods of time and the Spirit was kind of smothering them is that the Holy Spirit was lonely for Jesus who's in heaven and just trying to get close to the Jesus in you.
That's silly.
I thought, well, that's like the worst theology I ever heard. That's someone who doesn't know much about the idea of God biblically. I mean, it's just like crazy, right? So our understandings, our perspectives, even our interpretation of things has to be run through. We've got to listen. We have to listen.
Yeah.
First to the Word and then to what we perceive to be the Spirit. And again, there'll be a lot of things that I don't know, the Scripture doesn't speak to that, or here's how, so the waters flowed, right? We got the car tires and the dead bodies out on the first pass through, and then we passed through the viewpoint of the world, and we got the dead squirrels and the big pine cones out, and now we're moving through the filter of the Word, and wow, some things pass through, and we have to decide, is that a stone or is that a seed? Is that like a little rock, or is that like a seed that's going to bear fruit? How are you going to find out? You got to plant it. Some things will pass through. Now I got to do something to find out, is this? So I offer and I ask. It's like, what do you think?
That's good.
The last thing, the fourth thing, though, just to again underline the point we started with. But where does it go from there? It says, "Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. This is how God showed his love among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. This is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins." So the final filter is love. Paul will say in 1 Corinthians 14 that, prophetic words are for strength, comfort, and encouragement, that's what they're meant to impart. And so that we ought to take that seriously. I think it could be loving. Certainly a parent sometimes has to scare their child, like of the consequence, like, do not run into the street. This is what could happen. Maybe there's, I would be careful about that, but there's, I'm not saying that strength, comfort, and encouragement couldn't be found in confrontation or challenge, but in general, I think the filter is love. Carl, you were telling me about instances, and I remember this. Some prophetic person would say, "Oh, I dealt with this not that long ago. I had some person in my church come and make an accusation of child abuse against one of our pastors."
Wow.
And there was no evidence. It wasn't like she saw something. She had a dream. And her expectation was, I was going to deal with this, discipline this person based on this accusation. A person who I have intimate knowledge of their family relationships and what a loving, kind of righteous father and husband he is. I just think, oh gosh. What was the first break on that was love. Now again, abusers can be great at hiding, so I had a little conversation with his daughter. Nobody knew about it. Nobody, wasn't like I called her in and, has anybody been touching you inappropriately? I just had a conversation with her where I just kind of, hey, how's it going? Ask different questions, just see if anything would flag, anything would kind of register that said this is a person under pressure. This is a person who's dealing with things at a deeper level, even if they're unwilling to show that. And it's just like, oh gosh, what are we doing? Sometimes a group of people that have a lot of interest in prophecy, it becomes like a shooting gallery. I mean, they're bouncing off walls, and people get hurt. People get hurt. So love, if you aren't loving God, loving others, you don't know God. You don't know His voice. You don't know what's really going on. You better holster your gun.
That's good.
Okay. Hope this is helpful.
There we are.
Feeling the right kind of pressure. This is, I'm sure you know this. Pressure and prophecy have a similar relationship to desire and prophecy. Pressure, when it comes to your life and hearing from God for you, it's the last thing you need. It's unfortunate that most people only really want to hear from God about their life or direction when they're in crisis.
Right.
That's really unfortunate, because that's like the worst time for you to hear from God. You're under such pressure. What happens under that pressure? That pressure produces a desire to be out from under it, a desire for relief, a desire to be free from pain, whatever, and that desire will be distorted. So personal pressure to hear from God when you're in crisis is not a helpful. It's like, wow, I should have heard from Him when I was not under pressure. So it's just a fact. So it doesn't make any less necessary to hear from God when we're under pressure. It just means that we need to have the wisdom to know, wow, this is a really vulnerable place, and I got to be really careful what I think the Lord is saying under this kind of pressure. Because a lot of people under crisis and pressure will believe really disastrous things that they think God is telling them. And it will really, talk about multiplying pain, talk about kind of making a crisis worse, is to have some sense of a word from God that you got for that crisis that's not God at all. That's that. So what does that say? That says, wow, just like that clarity cost thing, like those times when things are like, there's room, it's like, I really need to open my heart to hear from God about the future. 2 years ago, 3 now, 3 years ago, I'm not even 60 yet. I'm well, and I just hear so clearly from God, it's time to transition your leadership to the next generation. And I spoke to good friends about it. They said, no, you don't want to. You're not even 60 yet. You have 15 more years. You'll regret this. You'll end up. And no, it was so clear to me. But there was no pressure to do it. It was just so clear to me. And so I began the process. And at the very end of the process, it was like, well, guess what? You have a cancer diagnosis that says that you're not going to live more than a couple of years. Well, whether that happens or not, I don't know. But I do know that I was really glad I got that word about transition before I had the diagnosis. You know what I mean? Like, oh no, I got to transition to this church. Like, here, you have it. I'm so glad. Really. So glad. Hear from God now.
That's a good word.
About your life. Get it confirmed by others that you love and trust, and can say, I think that is the Lord. here, part of the clarity cost thing is, I'm the only one that believes it. Ooh. Wow. You need to have massive clarity. To be the only one that believes something and reject the counsel of your friends or mentors or people who love you are telling you, don't do it. You just need to have visible visitation from an angel or something. And even then, let's check your medication. It's like, I know people, prominent people, who believe something so deeply at the core, like something like that, and what I'm telling you, something that they alone believe against everyone else because of some experience, and it's false.
Oh.
It's false. It's like, get back up. The hard things, the personal things, get back up. Get people who say, I can see it, I'm with you. Otherwise, just a lot of danger there. Now here's the interesting thing about pressure. Pressure on you, for you, bad. Pressure on you, for others, good. There's some things that God wants to bring through your life for other people that will never happen without pressure. Like in other words, you need to be pressed to be listening to do something for them. To speak or act on God's behalf. Pray in His leading. So what I always tell people who come to me and say, man, I'm a prophet. Not that many people do that anymore, but they used to. And people do come to me and say, I've got these, revelations happening to me. What should I do? The first thing that I want them to do is get in the trenches with people. I want them to join the prayer ministry. I want them to have people in front of them regularly who are saying, well, I'm in need, I'm hurting, this is going on in my life. And then you apply that discipline. Like, I don't know this person, I'm just meeting them, they're telling me a little bit about their need, but rather than respond with my best effort and my nicest words, I'm going to stop and say, Lord, do you have something that you want to say? I'm going to put myself under that pressure and that discipline, their need, this moment, and say, God, speak through me.
That's good.
You need that. For others, that will cause things to flow. Like, again, you have to pay the price. You have to offer and ask. You have to, have confidence and dependence and not pride and insecurity. You have to negotiate the road, but that pressure will be really helpful. Like, really helpful to stand in that place consistently with people who need some prayer, need God to work in their life, and they're asking you to be part of that, and you restrain your own stuff and say, God, is there something you would give through me? Because maybe some of my stuff is what you want me to give them, but if there's something that you want me to pass on, I'm here, I'm listening, I'm participating. It's a great pressure to have consistently in our life. Lastly, Jesus says in Matthew 7, that the test is fruit. Watch out for false prophets. Jesus says they come to you in sheep's clothing. In other words, it's not outward appearance, it's not how they come across that will be the indication, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus by their fruit you will recognize them. That ultimately it's about fruit. So the growth curve, on one side of it, on our side as participants of of putting ourselves in that place of restraint and saying, God, lead me in this interaction or this opportunity with others, lead me. But part of what will happen is I need to see the fruit of that. Like, is that a seed or a pebble that I'm offering? And it won't simply be their response in the moment. If I could, I've heard people talk about this. Wow, I didn't know about the word, but wow, when they burst out in tears when I gave it, I knew it was God. Well, that could be some of the beginning evidence of that,
Right.
but not necessarily, because the fruit will be the impact of it. The fruit will be what is produced by it, and so we just have to be watching. Like, that's why it's so helpful. I spent some years with different prophetic people traveling all over, and you kind of parachute in someplace, and a bunch of words are fired off, and people are maybe impressed or not impressed by that, and then off you go, and you never know. Like, those people, it's bad for them, it's bad for the people it happens to. And, what is so helpful is over time to be able to see what a word means and what a word does. Like, and again, most words that we would offer, or prayers we would offer somebody, they don't change everything. Some do. You're a voice and not an echo. Some do change everything, but some are just contributing to something. So it's not like we're looking for absolute transformation, but we're looking for evidence of impact. That will encourage us, and obviously that is the thing that we're looking for and what comes towards us. And I have to say, I'll just go back to this point, and then we'll have opportunity for some discussion or questions. But being around really gifted people and seeing what goes wrong in terms of identity and character on the one hand, and in terms of kind of biblical understanding on the other, that it goes really wrong. And so the bad fruit is not just someone got an errant word. That's a struggle. Like, this person told me this, it wasn't true at all. Like, okay, now I got to process that. My relationship with them or lack of one, and the fact that I live in a world where I got to navigate this minefield of people dropping bombs on you that aren't true. But here's the bad fruit. The bad fruit ultimately is loss of faith. Is the undermining of the very thing that it was meant to serve, which is that loving, trust-filled relationship with God. And so, when the fruit of something is, over time, lots of people with less faith or no faith, then you got to say that's not God. That's not God.
Wow.
And when someone's life, I'm not saying that we all need to be perfect, because Lord knows we're not. But we got to be honest. And we got to be real. And when that doesn't exist, then I just have to say, I'm sorry if I'm stepping on anyone's toes, but I don't know how anyone can listen to virtual prophets. People they have no relationship with, never seen up close, don't know how they live, what their family's like. I don't know how that's... we live this is a unique time in history of humanity, where you can have people on the internet or people on television or whatever that are being like a virtual prophet to you, and you don't have any way at all to examine their life. None. And I just think it's a disastrous link up. And I even giving grace for people who are desperate, and maybe they don't have anybody, all of that, but to be able to kind of witness how someone really is, as part of the factoring in of what is the fruit of what I'm receiving from them, my gosh, Jesus could not have fathomed that in saying John 10, my sheep follow me because they hear my voice, that he would end up with a bunch of sheep that follow a virtual voice. Not even a real one. Not even a present one. Not even a one that we know anything really about. So that's kind of a bummer way to end, but that's all I got. So I believe it. I believe it strongly.
I do too.
Anybody got any questions? Anything you want to ask? Because we could do, yes, fire away.
Even if it's a really great prophetic word, people have to respond. So sometimes you don't see any fruit. I don't even know what the question is in that, except for that you can't really beat yourself up all the time when
No.
people don't move forward, right?
Yeah, absolutely right.
They're responsible.
That's absolutely right. There's some, so it's not just simply a matter of there was impact, there was not, or it was bad impact. Sometimes the no impact thing, what do you do with that? And I tend to set those on the shelf. Because there may not be any impact now, but there may be later. And there may not be any impact now, and maybe later I recognize, oh, that probably wasn't on target, It's the same way I feel about some dreams that come through that have weight to them, but I can't figure them out. And I don't just throw them away, I set them on the shelf. I think, I don't know about that. And it's fascinating because God is a parent, Like I love this about God. It's like, then when that thing the dream was about happens, he'll go, remember that dream I gave you? This was this thing that okay, I can pick it up now off the shelf. It's like, I didn't know what to do with that. It's, my fault, my bad, whatever. But now I can take it off the shelf. There is a shelf, so it's not just... And so you're right, like somebody doesn't respond at all doesn't mean that you got to put it on the shelf. So you can't carry it. It can't be like, oh, now I need to feel bad because I missed it. I just have it on the shelf. I don't know. Maybe I'll know about that later. Maybe I won't. Yes.
Just to carry the thought further, because earlier you said that eagerly seeking an outcome can
Warp it, yeah.
warp things. Where does our responsibility then extend to as in bringing a prophetic word? In terms of is my job to bring the word and where it lands and how it lands is how it lands? Or how much, where
Yes.
lies my responsibility and how do I walk that out so that it doesn't either hinder me or I get caught up in something that isn't mine to hang on to?
Yes. So the way that I would understand that is that if I'm listening and I'm receiving something that's come from the Lord, and then I'm trying to respond to that and act or speak or pray in regards to what I've received, then that's what I need to have eager desire to do, to both receive and to respond. What I got to keep my hands off of is what my responding and my activity or my prayer produces. That's what I got to take my hands off of. In other words, if I think, and then, like this would not be like, okay, I feel like this leader in something they're really off base, and so what I really want them to do is change. And so I think I have this understanding or correction for them, but what I really want is that change rather than simply respond lovingly to what God's giving me and respond lovingly to them. I think that I'm in danger because I'm after the outcome. And I'm in danger of the way that happens actually frustrating the outcome. So I would agree, yes, you kind of leave it to like, do I want them to change? You bet. Do I want things to be different? I do. But my desire is focused on both the receiving and the responding, and I am leaving what actually happens to that, as long as it's, again, guarded by love, I'm leaving that to them and to the Lord, because I can't do more than that. I can't impose it. I can't control them. I have to leave it to them and to the Lord. You know, I don't know if I'm exactly understanding what the question is, but that's how I feel about it.
I guess part of it is sometimes trying to decide, is the Lord revealing this to me for prayer, to intercede, or
Yes.
is there a step further to bring the word? And once the word is delivered, then am I like, I'm done?
Yes.
Or, do I continue to pray into that? Or, I mean, because at some point, what people do or don't do with the word can have a real impact on me if I let it.
Yes, absolutely. That's why I think that you have to let it go, that your general approach would be to let it go, because it's like having too many lines in the water fishing or something. Like I can only have so many lines. With exceptions, if the Lord wouldn't let me let it go, that I continue to pray, that it seems to me that I let it go. Now, that's a very good question about, do I pray or do I do something with it? And to me, I'd always start with the prayer and see if that relieved it. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I got this thing, a concern, and so I pray. Did I feel relieved in that prayer, or is that not enough? And now I'm on to, I'm looking for an opportunity to offer, to ask. And now in a lot of times, it's like the Lord, I really do trust the Lord to make a way for that. Like, I want to offer, to ask what I have, but I also want the Lord to orchestrate that I don't just make that happen.
Right.
You know, that gives me confidence. Like, oh, we weren't supposed to be sitting next to each other, but we are. Hey, I was praying for you. What does this mean anything to you? To me, I just have so much more confidence in that way than I, again, impose, controlled its situation. And you're right, if you hang on to what happens this is the life of a pastor. If I hang on to, did my message produce the fruit that I desired to produce in their life, and I have a conversation 10 minutes after I just gave a message, and I said they tell me how meaningful it was, and I asked them what parts were meaningful to, and they can't remember a bit of it, then if I hold on to that, I'm just going down, I'm just, the submarine is headed to the bottom of the floor. I got to let go of it. It's like you and God. I did my part as best I could. If there's more for me to do, I want to do that too, but I got to let it go. Anybody else? Yes.
More for perspective than a specific answer to a specific question, because it's kind of complicated, I think. But on the one hand, I've heard stories about people who moved in the prophetic, and, maybe that was even their ministry, their sort of, this is what I do. And the Lord would move through them and ministry through people prophetically, and they had problems in their personal life with sin and various things like that. And then there's another school of thought that just says, for the Lord to use you, you can easily block that use by having some level of sin in your life. So what is your perspective on the tension between what's going on in people's personal lives and the Lord using them in ministry prophetically?
Yeah. The question is about, people can be used mightily, and they've got real issues in their life, sin in their life, brokenness in their life, and yet, the other perspective is like that would block, God working. When it comes to gifting, and maybe especially when it comes to prophecy, that it's like the gifts are without repentance. It's like they're not taken back, they're not restricted, and you can be in a whole lot of bad stuff in your life and still operate. But does it mean that it's going to have the lasting ministerial effect? And I don't think so. I think there's loss. There's loss in the brokenness. But I don't think
That's
that
interesting.
that it's true that the gifting is not still in operation, because I've just seen too much of it.
Right.
I mean, we're a Vineyard. Our history is colored by people like Lonnie and others who had real brokenness in their life, but their gifting still contributed something, and that's a mystery. Nancy and I were talking last night about a dear prophetic friend no longer living, but we were in a meeting that they came into and described, like the exposure and the fall of someone in the room, in a very detailed way, and it was them. Months later, it was them.
Wow.
Wow.
Hello?
Yeah.
They were,
So gift and character, you wish that the bigger the gift, the better the character.
you hope so.
But honestly, with prophecy, because I think of some of the things we're talking about, some of the issues of it being veiled, and I think that the desperation, the eager desire part, we could substitute desperation. Like nothing is working, and I desperately need this. That I think that sometimes in really broken people's lives, they have a more fertile ground for that. And so the prophetic flower, even in the midst of just terrible brokenness. And so this gift kind of advances alongside this life not together, not working. And it's a mystery, I have to say, but I've seen it over and over again. And I long for really healthy, functional people to be more prophetic. I long for it. And I'm hopeful for it because I believe it's for everybody. I believe it's not like, wow, that's a special case. You really are led by the Spirit. I just don't think that's supposed to be true. I think we're all supposed to be that at some capacity. But it seems that people who have a high capacity are often dealing with real brokenness inside. We're ready?
Yeah.
Cool. Oh, sorry. Yes, please.
You're talking about pressure and trying to hear in the midst of pressure.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, it's like the apostles in the boat with Jesus in the storm. Lord, don't you care that we're perishing? He wakes up and do we need to develop an intimacy with the Lord so that we can hear him even in the storm? Or is it wiser to rely on, say, the body of Christ to come alongside us in times when we're in a storm and hear from them?
So first I would say that when we're under pressure or crisis, there's no restriction on us crying out to God, right? Which is how I would more interpret the storm in the boat. I'm not at all saying that, you should limit, but honestly, when we're in a crisis, we tend to even need others to pray for us. Like, if the crisis is big enough, honestly, it'll take your breath away. It'll take your ability to pray away. And so we do really need people to step in for us. But very specifically in terms of hearing from God like the answer, and I think you're right. I think that a mature person knowing that, that they're not firing off their first flare to heaven under crisis. A mature person has been in crisis again and again, and would have a greater capacity to hear from God under that pressure than someone who'd never done it.
That's right.
So I totally agree that it's not like that is impossible for you to hear from God, but you would have to be fairly disciplined in how you were receiving it to not let that pressure have distorted things. So you would have a maturity that was being pretty careful with what I'm hearing and able to test it along, kind of number of levels. And I agree, that should be the goal, that we have that kind of maturity that would enable us to do that. But I would still think that we would need others no matter what.
That's good.
And the bigger the crisis, probably the more that we need others.
Right.
Yeah.
When we come back, you can ask more questions. But we're going to break for an hour. And so be back here by 12:30. And save your question. Don't stop David on the way out.
Oh, man.
and ask your questions. You ask your questions in front of everybody. And, but that's pretty good stuff, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So, Lord, we just thank you for this morning. We pray, Lord, that we seep into the deepest parts of our being. Lord, that we'd grow in wisdom and understanding and of you and of your word. And Lord, we pray that we could operate with great power because you've given it to us, not because we long for it, but because you just have empowered us. So anyway, I pray you bless our time as we eat, and when we get back, we should pray it would be a profitable time. Okay, amen. So we will come back and we'll talk about the word, but and David's approach to the word is very, very helpful. But you can still ask questions related to prophetic, because I'm sure you have some. Okay. And, I want to give it over to you, but I want to ask a question. One thing I wanted to say, and he didn't say this, but there are distinctions that can be made from this teaching we're receiving, and you can. I know within. I'm just going to say this. I feel very, very much so in charismatic circles that they're afraid to evaluate things. And so, because it's always, we can't judge them. And I was thinking about the other day, and I was thinking, I'm not judging them, I'm just observing. Like when I come here on the 405, I go like 65, and the people pass me going 85. And I notice them. I notice that they're speeding.
Yeah.
I don't know them, I don't judge them. I might say that they're not the best. Yeah. But so I think it's good. I think it's good to like have ways to measure things. I think it's healthy.
Yeah.
And so I think the stuff he's been teaching has been very good. And what I wanted to ask you is to start off with just a couple of stories with prophetic people that you. And the thing that you told me last night that Paul came. That account, what you said.
Let me preface the story with this, again, under the first principle, love and establishing a loving, trust-filled relationship, that faith, trust, is like a bridge that's built between two solid places. One is the reality of the way things are now, and the second is the reality of the way they're going to be. If you alter either of those, if you're off, if you deny the reality of what is now, or you're wrong about what is to come, you put the bridge off of its moorings and it's prone to collapse. And so that bridge of faith has to be anchored in reality. And my principal regret, that's maybe too personal because I don't feel that I did it much, but what I was part of that pushed forward various prophetic understandings or whatever, that my regret is that it can easily, if there aren't ways in which to get back to reality, it can easily kind of shift off of reality and stay off of reality. The story that Carl is referencing is that back a couple of decades ago that I traveled with Paul Cain, who's one of the prophetic figures in Kansas City, and Paul is a sweet person, a deeply broken person, like most of us are. That but I, someone that I love, and so we traveled together, had some crazy experiences together, and then I moved to England, and we lost track and really hadn't been in contact for a couple of decades, And then he called me out of the blue and said, I'm nearby, and hey, I'd love to see you. And we have a Saturday night service. I said, I have this service, but afterwards we could go to dinner. And he said, great. He came to the service, and I showed him around our campus, and then we headed off to dinner, and he and I in the front seat, and he said to me, David, is it true what they say about you? I said, a lot of people say a lot of stuff, kind of depends on what they're saying. And he said, well, that they say that you don't believe in the prophetic anymore, that you've turned your back on the prophetic. And I said, that's not true. I said, I do believe in the prophetic, but I don't believe in the prophetic that never admits its mistakes.
Good.
That never takes ownership over being wrong. In order to what? Reestablish the foundation of reality. So
That's good.
So, that whole idea, and it's perpetuated, of course, by itinerant, I'm never in the same place again, so I never have to actually own my mistakes and live with them.
Right.
It's perpetuated by that, but this idea that we can explain away and minimize being wrong and doing it wrong, some of the things I'm talking about, where I make someone else pay the price for my imperfection, all of that. I don't believe in that kind of prophetic. I don't believe in a prophetic that undermines people's faith. That the end result is not strength, comfort, and encouragement. It's something different than that. Even though there may be revelation and sizzle attached, at the end of the day, what is supposed to last from the communication of God to our life is this bridge that links our life with His and our present with His future.
That's good.
So, yeah. It just needs to be, I think in a whole lot of arenas of Christian activity, there just needs to be a deeper level of humility, a deeper honesty about not having everything figured out and pretending that we don't make mistakes or don't get things wrong or haven't historically kind of, messed things up. Go ahead.
So how was that received?
Paul said to me, I believe the same thing. That's what he told me. So I believe like you believe. So that's the perspective of someone through a lot of wars, but he understood what I was saying. He understood that I was not saying I reject the prophetic. He was understood that I was rejecting the way that it had operated in so much of what we had been a part of together. Yeah.
So in some of that, like with the prophetic, and then like you're trying to marry it with the apostolic. So how is that supposed? Are there people who are supposed to speak into the prophets' lives when they get stuff wrong, or how is that to be managed?
Yeah.
And then, or like if it's going to really work, how is it going to work going forward? If we're going to move into that in a greater way, in a way that is more helpful to the body and advancing the kingdom.
Yes. So for someone, it's a great question, like how does that operate? Someone whose primary gifting is prophetic, and maybe it could be even their exclusive gifting is prophetic, right? That how does that person is going to operate in a healthy way? And I can only speak from kind of retrospect, kind of looking back on the mistakes that were made. I would say that because, within particularly public or conference ministry or, those things that seem to have like the widest impact, that the only way that happens is from a platform or holding a microphone or whatever. I think in part it's that model of how things are transferred and multiplied that does not serve the prophetic very well. So for instance, someone whose gifting is primary prophetic, they are likely not a teacher, and yet they attempt to teach and they do so very badly. And they're not a pastor, and yet you're giving them access to the hearts and hopes of people, and they don't handle that very well. So, you have all of these issues of like, how do they function? And I, in retrospect, I wish, particularly with people who had real respect for. Bob Jones is a name, some of you may not know that name, but Bob was literally a sharecropper's son with a second grade education from Arkansas. Like he grew up picking cotton and had no education, was an alcoholic and a brawler, got saved, and has this gift. And in Kansas City days, I planted a location far away from everyone else, and Bob came there. And it was part of my congregation.
That's all.
Right? And here's how, to have some super gifted person like that, here's how it would go. Like, I would walk in on Sunday morning, and he'd already be there with his wife, Iola.
Yeah.
And he'd come up to me and he'd give me the scripture I was going to preach. In those days, I wasn't doing series, it wasn't announced in advance, and he would say, you're going to speak on this and this passage, and the Lord told you to say this and this, and I just go,
It's so good.
yeah, okay, yeah, that's right, sit down. It was like that. I mean, they're just very, just strange and wonderful, and
He was right when he was telling you that?
yeah, oh yeah,
Oh, okay.
always, always right.
So good.
And yet, as much as affection as I had for Bob and regard I had for him, he had no business ever having a microphone, ever. His theology fit in a thimble. Like he had, and yet he was wonderful with people, and especially the more broken you were, the more wonderful he was. That's why I had such regard for him, because he wasn't, a lot of times really highly. They just want, who are the really important people? I'll deal with those. Bob was like, he knew where he came from, and so he should have been pastored in our system in a very backroom kind of way that allowed his gift and his heart for individuals to flourish, and did not put on him the expectation that he had to make pronouncements about the way reality is, because he didn't have those to make. And so my frustration with highly gifted, maybe more exclusively prophetic gifted people, is their unwillingness to be pastored.
Yeah.
Because they think somehow their revelatory gift trumps your pastoral gift, or your teaching gift, or your leadership gift, in the case of being apostolic. That's the tragedy of it, because revelation is heady and intoxicating, and that's why it has this greater ability to claim your identity. Like, I'm not just a person who hears from God, I'm a prophet, and that makes me great, it makes me special and important and better than you. And so the difficulty of trying to speak life and wisdom to people, they just don't hear it. And they should, because it's crash and burn. I mean, the history is crash and burn for most people who are it's like, it is not, it's like saying, you're going to write a book, telling like what revelation means. The history is really bad. You just jumped on a line of 2,000 years of failure and said you're going to be right. Like, what a bad idea. Similarly, I'm going to have this kind of exclusive, public, prominent prophetic ministry. You're just standing on a mountain of brokenness and failure. So if you could combine like pastors and leaders' willingness to deal with the weirdness and to love the brokenness and the willingness to receive it, something really wonderful could take place. But I just not seen it very often. And there are really mature, highly gifted prophetic people who are really responsible, and I just wish there were a lot more of them, that had that kind of Ephesians 4. When Ephesians 4 talks about the equipping of the saints with these different ministries, teaching, preaching, pastoring, apostles and prophets, those are all talking about parenting, reproductive ministry, right? Like, these are people who are reproducing other people. So I could be a teacher, but if I'm also a teacher that inspires other teachers, then that's multiplying what I do. So a prophetic person who's meant to multiply what they do by inspiring, equipping other people, that doesn't necessarily have to be done from the platform at all. unless they're just gifted for that. So.
The impression that I get, anything that deals with a flock has to be pastor.
Yeah.
Whether it's prophecy or whatever, it has to be pastor. And that's part of the maturity that needs to be faced. And the analogy that I see in the whole deal with prophecy is that, and pastoring, it's like at a parade in front of the horses. You've got the one guy that's leading the horses, but you also have that guy that's behind the horses that has to pick up all the stuff that the horse is dropping all around the parade crowd.
Yeah.
So, and it's unfortunate for the pastor, but that's what happens.
Yeah.
Just a quick question. Where have you,
I had a job as a 14-year-old, or was applied for a job in a very wealthy person, had stables and had all these Arabian horses, and the job was for a pilot, and I thought I was going to be like exercising the horses and riding the horses, and then it turned out to be pilot there and pilot there.
on that note,
Right along.
have you experienced, have you been in situations where it's been, where people have cleaned up their mess well, or I mean, because that's what I hear you saying, is that if you're going to express this is what God is saying and you get it wrong, there's a mess to clean up at some point. And have you seen it where prophetic people have cleaned up their own messes?
I haven't, like I wish, and maybe I'm just not remembering examples of it, but I haven't, but nevertheless I believe that it can be very powerful.
I would think so.
Very, very powerful. Maybe as impactful, for the good as the mistake was for the bad, or even more so. Like, we're in Southern California, we're down here in Orange County. I don't know, maybe he did. Did Chuck Smith ever apologize for saying Jesus was going to come back and was wrong? Like, to do that and say I was really wrong and to change your kind of theology or your approach because you were so wrong. I just never seen anybody do it. Like, hey, I was really off and I'm really sorry, and here's the changes I'm making to ensure that doesn't happen again. And that would be wonderful. That would be so, I think, profoundly like maturing, like healing almost. But I just don't, it's like with our children, right? Like what parent doesn't make mistakes, right? And I'm sorry to go to this spot, but as a pastor, I have sat, and I have to say the vast majority with women, I've sat with people who have been abused sexually and physically, and all the thing that they want most is that the person, the parent who did it, would acknowledge it and say they're sorry, and they never did. They never did. Just, I did this, I'm sorry, powerful. It releases people out from under who suffered because you did it. Now, it's not the end all, it doesn't change or it doesn't make everything better, but it makes it better. Not all better, but it better. And the inability for us to do that kind of thing, to say I was really wrong, Nancy and I, we in our heart for the poor, when we were living in Vancouver, we took in a homeless kid off the streets. He was 15 years old and an absolute addict. And we moved him into we had little children. We gave him a bedroom right across from our oldest daughter, who was like 5 or 6 at the time. Nothing terrible happened, but it was stupid. And in retrospect, I had to say to my daughter, who kind of slept in fear,
right.
This kid would sit on the roof and smoke cigarettes all night. And, we were trying to do good. We had this big heart, but, Lindy, I'm sorry that I did that I put you in that position where you felt vulnerable. You know, you have to own stuff. You have to try to lift it with some sense of regret. And it just hardly ever happens in the prophetic. That someone will say, man, I was just like way off. You know, like, they don't do it. So, anybody else? Yes.
So I think one of the things that's hard is, as far as even owning it, is the whole, like Lauren was saying, putting it on the shelf. I mean, when do you, like, we were talking about this earlier, like, but in the Abraham, like in Hope Against Hope, like, yeah, I believe this for 25 years and it hasn't happened. Well, was the guy wrong?
Yeah.
He gave me the prophetic word?
Wow.
Or is it still on the shelf because God has a bigger plan?
There you
Or
go.
is it something I have to contend for because it's just warfare after warfare? The enemy's trying to thwart my destiny. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
there's so
Good
many
question.
things that
Sure.
that happen with the prophetic, and it's like, I don't think people know sometimes.
Right. But I'm talking about quantifiably wrong. Like, you know,
You're gonna live and.
you die, you know, it's gonna happen then, it doesn't happen. You're gonna have a child, you never have a child. I mean, you know, like the quantifiably wrong stuff. You're right, maybe it takes time to get in that category, maybe it never gets in that category. And I think for some things, you know, I'm not just saying, wow, you were completely wrong. It's sometimes just the interpretation, how you interpret it, what you saw might have been something real, but you offered it and interpreted it in such a way that wasn't right, wasn't true. So it doesn't necessarily invalidate that you got something, but what you did with it, you made a mistake, you know. And I just don't think there's any growth in our life without owning our mistakes. There's no way for us to progress, you know, without saying, you know, I haven't reached maturity. I haven't, you know, Jesus said, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. It's not perfection in an abstract way. That's not how the Bible uses the idea of perfection. That's the, you know, more Greek philosophy, that there's this ideal form, you know, like a perfect egg is a certain color and shape and size. But the biblical idea of perfection is that a perfect egg is a chicken.
Come on.
It's become what it was meant to be.
What it was meant to be.
So the Father is perfect. He's complete. He's finished. Be finished, complete, like your Father. Aren't perfect
There's no
like
combination.
the Father is. That we're completed. There's no completion. There's no getting to that point without owning along the way the brokenness, the failure, the sin. You know, it's not just like repentance is so that God can rub our nose in it. It's like there's no way forward without an acknowledgement of what's true, what's real. Faith isn't possible without being built on those twin towers of reality. Now, what is to come?
That's good.
Yeah. Okay, anybody else? Yes.
Are you making a distinction between spiritual and emotional maturity here?
I think that they're related. I think that, I don't know how you would define spiritual maturity as distinct from being more emotionally healthy. I mean, like you could say, well, I know a lot, or I've experienced a lot, but if you are an emotionally unhealthy person, you've hurt people a lot. I don't know. I would have a hard time drawing a distinction between that and saying, well, you were spiritually mature, but you were just emotionally not, so you hurt a lot of people. I don't know if I could make that distinction.
So as you're talking about maturity,
Yes.
is it fair then for me to think emotional maturity is...
Wholeness, I think, is the way I would want to describe it. You know, like that we're moving towards this finish, this completion, this what we're meant to be,
Okay.
and so that involves all these components of who we are. You know, including our spiritual understanding, our spiritual connectedness, but also our emotional health, our mental health, our life. Yes.
Thank you.
So it seems like it's very important for the prophetic to be coming with the right heart motive.
Yes. Well, that's where we started from, that love has got to be the goal. And that will help, but that's not like a guarantee. So I gotta have that as the goal of why I'm doing it, what I'm doing. But I also then, in the how I do it, I've got to use humility and honesty. I've got to do it in a way that maximizes the upside and minimizes the downside. Yes.
What if you feel like you got out a big word, and you go back to God and say, okay, now was this really you, or was this the pizza, and nothing happened? You get no response. Does that mean, no, you shouldn't go forward with it? Or does it mean that it's just my brokenness that I question it instead of doing it on the first thing? Or can you comment regarding that?
Again, I have a pretty big shelf in my life, so there'd be a lot of things where I wouldn't know, to be honest. Like for instance, if I was in a meeting and I felt like there was a certain need that maybe God wanted us to reach out to and touch, and I spoke that need out and nobody responded, then I wouldn't immediately conclude that I had been wrong, but that would be a possibility. That I was pizza, or, just me, and I would put it on the shelf. But I would also leave open the possibility, well, nobody wanted to, publicly respond. That's a lot of pressure. Maybe I would just leave it on the shelf. There'd be a lot of things on my shelf in that regard. But I would never rule out as a principle that I might be wrong. Like that wouldn't be my default position was, oh, I guess somebody just was afraid to admit it. I was right and they were wrong. Yeah.
What do you say to people that are close to you that are dubious about the prophetic, and they, throw questions out? Well, how do you know that's true? I've been listening to prophetic people lately, and well, how do you know that's true? And I think they're questioning my giftedness, and they're very close to me. And can't say they make me feel, but I feel as if they know me well enough to know, well, you couldn't do that.
Yeah. Well, part of that's the problem of familiarity. People that are familiar with you, familiarity breeds contempt. No prophet has honor in his own hometown. There's part of it where it's just a perception of who you are, and that doesn't fit with who we think you are. And I think that the best way to combat that, I got the best advice ever when I was a brand new Christian. None of the people in my family knew Jesus, and of course I wanted them to. And I think maybe a year or two into my Christian life, I thought, man, nobody's I'm not winning any of my family to the Lord. And I talked to this older guy, Christian, and he said, just stay steady for the next 20, 25 years. Watch what happens. You know what I mean? Watch. You don't have to worry. Watch what happens. And it's true. The impact over time was very real, very significant. But I think that I just think that you continue. My answer to that question is, how do I know it to be true? My honest answer was, well, I don't completely know it to be true, but I do know that I'm following in a committed way Jesus, who I believe is not a story, not an idea of the past, but a person who lives and communicates, and I'm trying to respond to that. And sometimes I absolutely know, because of how it works out, that it was right. And in this case, whatever they're objecting to, I'd say, well, I can't give you absolute guarantees, but what I can tell you is it comes out of this relationship of following that I have with Jesus, and you'll have to decide for yourself whether or not that makes a difference or makes any sense.
Well, what about a perfect person that Bob Jones or Paul Cain, if their questioning is more, how do we know they're right? Well,
again, I don't think that that's Matthew 7. That's by the fruit, and right about what? Bob had terrible relationships with his own family. He had real brokenness in his life. Paul is a lone, just has lived in a really isolated, troubling way. And so write about life, maybe not. Write about this word that they gave that the Lord seemed to be saying something. Well, you're going to know that by the fruit of it. You know, like I think that with most people that I've known who've been highly prophetic, I would have some skepticism about their life. So I wouldn't just say, like I have some people in my life that the quality of their life is so high that if they said something to me, my inclination would be to give them the benefit of the doubt. Like, because my regard for them is so great, I'm going to be listening with a lean towards, like, you have something real to offer me. Whereas I think that in the prophetic, I think unless we have that with someone, we are leaning backwards. Like, the word itself needs to have fruit for me to embrace it as the Lord. Here's an example from Paul, and I'm not trying to be critical or judge, but Paul could know, he would be a kind of person who would know that your address at 3 years old, or your phone number when you were 12, or some bizarre, almost arcane bit of information like that. And I've watched people get that kind of, and it blows your mind, like, how could you know, wow, God, only God could have. Right. But the outcome of that, like, what's the end result of that, knowing that?
They can move.
Yeah, like, what am I gaining? Nothing. Like, it didn't really impact them in any way other than that was a very interesting experience, and it seemed like God was really there, but the end result was nothing changed, really. And then I'd have questions. If that was me, I'd wonder, like, what was that really? I don't know what that was, because I can't for sure say that was something true or something God or something, life establishing. So, yeah. We good? Okay. All right. Was there anything else you wanted me to touch base on that? Did I miss it?
No, that was great. It really was.
Okay.
Especially that part about me and weighing words. Equality.
Did you ever have Paul King give you a word?
Yeah.
What's that about? Interpretive dance, or what was that?
You know what? I got a witness to that last week.
Did you?
Yeah, it was a dream.
Was it meaningful? Or was it just like, wow, like that was interesting that...
Which part of the dance?
No, the word, like...
Yeah, it was, but I mean...
Yeah, it's hard to...
They all saw me at Anaheim, and they all thought I should be there. And
okay.
Yeah, so...
Okay, yeah, that's really hard to interpret that. Like, what was that?
Yeah, that was in the early days, so it was tough.
Yes.
So,
I'm going to give you I have to just do this because you'll like it. But I'm going to give you a Bob Jones story, okay? Like, Bob should not have, he should not have ever had a microphone, should never have been allowed to talk about the tiny blue angel, any of those things. So I go to Guatemala on a missions trip when I'm in Kansas City. We have a work in the Yashil Triangle. It's an area where in the 70s and into the 80s, the government and the guerrillas battled one another. And as a result, they would go through villages. These are primitive people. This is Stone Age culture. They have a clicking language. We're talking about very primitive culture. And they would go back and forth through these villages and kill the men. Oh. And so the Yashil Triangle ended up in Guatemala with whole villages full of women and children, no men alive at all. And so we started building houses for these widows in the Yashil Triangle. They're just huts. They're mud-floored huts. But we began building these houses. We worked through Wycliffe, the Bible translators who were working on a translation of this clicking language into the New Testament. So I get invited to go. And first of all, I spoke for the conference of the Wycliffe people in the city, Guatemala, and then went into the Yashil Triangle. In the Yashil Triangle, there was a thriving church called Jesus Saves and Heals. And it was started by a guy who was caught by the government and put on his knees, put a gun to his head, and they pulled the trigger, and the rifle misfired. And so they beat him with the butt of the rifle and left him for dead. He didn't die. And he had cried out he was a Catholic background, cried out for Jesus to save him, to heal him. As a result of his life being spared, he began to preach Jesus saves and heals in this primitive culture and clicking language, and ended up with a few thousand people scattered throughout the region. So they brought all of their pastors together. This is too long a story. I'm sorry I started it. They brought all their pastors together for a day, and I was to teach them. In their language, they don't make abstractions. That's typical of ancient culture. You don't abstract things. So, in other words, I couldn't tell them, you need to love your neighbor as yourself. Love is an abstraction. I had to say to them, don't ball up your fist and strike your neighbor in the face. That's concrete action. They only had a language that communicated concrete action. It was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, this day, with trying to not make abstractions. And then at the end of the day, one of the pastors asked me if I would pray for a family in his village, grandmother, mother, daughter, no men. They all had tuberculosis. I said, I will, glad to. Literally, the plane is on the grass runway, the little prop plane is on the runway waiting for me. I go into the hut. It's terribly, terribly sad. There's 3 people dying, and it's not a pleasant way to die. And yet it also had a very dark sense. They have witch doctors, and they didn't turn to anything they needed. And so I prayed for them, and nothing particularly powerful or evident happened. But I prayed for them, and I blessed them, and I turned to leave, and a searing, sharp pain went right to I literally thought someone had stabbed me. I turned around thinking someone has stabbed me, but no one was there. I instantly had a fever of probably, 103, 104. I was doubled over in pain. I had to walk down the hill, sweating and in pain to get in the plane. I get in the plane. It's it's like a hopping thing to get to Nicaragua, and then it takes me forever and multiple changes of planes, and I literally think that I'm going to die before I get home, but I'm fairly certain that they're going to have to put me in a wheelchair to get me off of the final plane. Nancy's there waiting for me at the airport. I come off, and she thinks, what in the world has happened to you? I said, I don't know, but you're going to have to take me to the emergency room. But before you take me to the emergency room, let's go see Bob for a second. And so we went to his house. Just showed up at his house. He lived in this tiny little house with a screen front porch. I knock on the door, and I try to, everything. I just stood up straight and tried to put a smile on my face, and I knock on the door, and Bob comes through the screen of the door.
Yeah, come on.
He says, what's happened to you? What do you mean? What's happened to me? He said, turn around. I turned around. He puts his hand on the very spot, and he says, witchcraft has put a spear in you.
You bet.
And instantly I'm well.
Wow.
Ooh.
We all joined you.
Wow.
Instantly I'm okay.
That's good.
He said, wow, they came against you big time. Thanks, Bob. I'll see you later. I'm going home now.
Did you have a sense of that, though, when it happened? I mean, that it was spiritual?
Yeah, I thought that it was spiritual. And I obviously was praying, God help me, protect me, heal me.
Yeah.
But
that was pretty bad mojo.
This is the end of the story, and we're done with this. So years later, I after going to Africa, and I did a conference in South Africa, and then I was with some Zulu leaders, and I came back from that trip, and I was sick for a year. I went to tropical disease specialists. They didn't know what was wrong. Literally, I had a fever for a year. sweats, aches, like they couldn't figure out what was wrong with me, and they did lots of tests, and one of the tests turned up with the fact that my lymph nodes had calcified through my neck, which is a sign that I had tuberculosis. I never had tuberculosis that I know of, other than the knife in my back.
Right.
That I had tuberculosis. So it's just interesting, isn't it? It's just really, really interesting. So someone who's sensitive, wow, what a... And has authority, those two things. Yeah, it's just a tragedy that's lost by brokenness of identity and character and brokenness about ideas about God. So we got to do this thing, though. I want to do this thing with you. So it's about this foundation, this thing that needs to happen for intimacy. Intimacy is not possible with unreality. I mean, some of these stories that have been coming out.